Well, it's good to be reconvening. Enjoyed some of the questions during the break and look forward to more Q&A time together after this session. As I mentioned before, the Armenian genocide. We also talked about, mentioned the what's happening in Ukraine earlier, and now we come to a topic that brings us to our own day, our own way of thinking about warfare, injustice. How do we address issues of military force or even police force in a as Christians? Jesus, didn't he say turn the other cheek? Didn't he say don't resist the one who is evil? Well, how can we justify taking, for example, the right to bear arms? Is that something that is it's not the Bible? Is there some sort of a right that we have made from God to do that, or is there a place for the Christian to serve as a police officer, serving in the army? There are many Christians who would say, no, that's a contradiction in terms. I was at a conference in Nashville, the Evangelical Philosophical Society meeting, and Richard Hayes and Keith Pavlicek were on a panel discussion. And Richard Hayes, who's a noted New Testament scholar, very influential, wrote a book called The Moral Vision of the New Testament. And Richard Hayes teaches at Duke University, and he said that people who engage in recruiting military, if you're a Christian, you're a military recruiter, he said that is tantamount to being a part of an organization called Pimps for Jesus. So just, if you engage in recruiting people to serve in the army, it's like you're recruiting people to become prostitutes, in the name of Jesus. Now, is that really the view that the New Testament takes of things? Well, let's take a look. What I want to do is address the topic of just war and pacifism, and we'll insert something about terrorism in there too. I think these are all very relevant topics for us to consider. And what I'd like to do is just, as we look at just war and pacifism, to begin with just looking at a few assumptions on just war before we look at what the principles of just war are, and then what the New Testament says, and maybe even we can look at the early church if we have time. What do the early church fathers say about the Christian in the military? Is this something that is a contradiction in terms? So let's begin. Well, as we look at the issue of just war, what we are assuming here, just to talk about a few assumptions, that this theory takes into consideration that not all evil can be avoided, that there are certain intolerable evils that must be addressed, that evil, violence, aggression, and so forth will be with us, that it will be part of our world. How do we address it as believers, as people who stand up for justice? And is there something that I ought to be doing about it in terms of stopping it, maybe even physically seeking to stop it? And perhaps even lethally engaging, if it means, unfortunately, taking someone's life in order to protect the innocent. Now, when we talk about just war theory, we're talking about something that is rooted in, as was mentioned earlier, natural law, as well as the biblical record, that we see the two overlapping. And just war theory is something that is not just something that Christians do, but this is something that is binding for all people. As we read in Scripture, we see that God reveals Himself both in special ways, that is, in the Scriptures, as well as in Jesus of Nazareth, special revelation. But there's also a general revelation that is available to all people, and this includes rationality, it includes the conscience that we have, it includes human experience and so on. That these are part of the fabric of how God has made us. We are made in His image, and we can reflect on these things, and we can detect injustice, and we can stand up for injustice, stand up against injustice, even though we aren't Christians, because we've been made in the image of God. So the issue is not whether just a Christian can fight, but it's whether any person can fight. So we're talking about generalities here, not simply what is restricted to Christians to do. Also, just war theory doesn't try to justify war. We're not talking about warmongering here. We're not trying to talk about pulling the trigger as as quickly as possible. There are principled ways of going about things diplomatically, using war as a last resort rather than the first course of action. So again, this is part of just war thinking, and a lot of times it gets distorted. People thinking that just war seeks justification for any kind of military engagement. Also, just war theory does assume the right that private citizens don't have the right to use military force on their own. Now, I think that the right to bear arms is something that is appropriate. It does have the effect of deterring crime. That if you read Thomas Sowell's book, Intellectuals in Society, wherever you see stiff gun control laws, there you see more crime typically taking place. Where you have people who are able to protect themselves, goes down. There is a correlation. But I'm not going to get into that here. And again, I know this can be a politically charged issue, but again, statistically speaking, I think there's a fair case that can be made. Now, another preliminary point to make about just war is that a lot of people argue that there should be a presumption of peace, that we ought to pursue peace as the foremost obligation, that this is what we ought to do, and so people will be involved in, I think sometimes negotiations beyond what is warranted. Like Munich Peace Accords in 1938, where someone has shown no track record of keeping treaties and being a person of goodwill and so forth, and just mowing over one land after another. Again, we need to be alert to the kind of people we are negotiating with. There may come a time when we say, there is no indication that negotiations will even move forward, and so military course of action may be required, or if not, other things like sanctions and so forth. But again, the presumption of peace can actually, if you take that route, you may actually never come to the point where you engage militarily because, what about just taking one more step until it actually may be too late. So what we ought to do is actually take the course of the presumption of justice, that justice, rather than peace, is really what we ought to be considering. Because there may come a time where we say, something must be done in the name of justice, that we, even though we want peace, there are people who are being treated unjustly, and something needs to be done about this. So, peace, I should add this too. A lot of times, peace can be preserved even if a nation doesn't go to war, but has military might and offers protection for people. So even without firing a missile or a gun, people can feel protected because there is a strong military, and so one doesn't need to exert force, but it can deter bullies in the world from doing their worst. So there is something to military might without even having to actually exert that force. Just having the capability can deter. Another point is this. Just war is an expression of loving one's neighbor. A lot of people think, what? What do you mean by that? Well, protecting the innocent, protecting those who have been invaded, those who cannot protect themselves, that there is something very loving and gracious about protecting those who cannot defend themselves. And we utilize this in the police force, that the police are certainly, they use force to protect the innocent. And this would certainly apply not just domestically to a police force, but certainly internationally to an army. So there is this picture of protecting innocence. And not only is it for the present consideration, but also we think of future generations that will be affected. If we do not act, if we do not stop tyranny, if we do not try to avert certain things from taking place, this will impact future generations as well. It's not just a matter of the present, but also the future as well. So if we do not act, then we need to remember that this will affect other generations, future generations, not simply the present one. And of course, Proverbs 24 talks about those who are help those who are being led to the slaughter. Stop those who are being led to the pull them back. Hold them back from being led to the slaughter. But there is this picture of the use of force, even here in Proverbs, to protect those from being harmed by evil perpetrators. Also, when it comes, we'll talk about Jesus' ethic and so forth, but we need to be careful that as we talk about loving our enemies, that we don't absolutize this. But isn't love the greatest thing of all, that we're commanded to love God and love our neighbors? Well, yes. But remember how does Jesus engage in love? Jesus will engage in scathing denunciations of those who are opposing him, of those who are false teachers and leading people astray. Jesus says things like, "It'd be better to have a millstone hung around your neck than for you to be drowned in the depths of the sea than for you to lead one of these little ones astray." Very strong language here. I'm not saying that Jesus is speaking militaristically here, but Jesus is speaking with great severity, and there is his love is directed to those who are his own, and for those who are bringing harm to them, he is pronouncing judgment. And so there is a place for that, and we have to be careful about simply absolutizing loving your enemies. I mean, do we forgive terrorists for even while they're plotting against us? I mean, if your enemy, if your brother, repents, forgive him. Yes, but there is a presumption of repentance that is there. Jesus, in the same passage in Matthew 18, talks about forgiving 70 times 7. But it also talks about those who refuse to refuse to act on God's forgiveness, that they'll be handed over to the torturers. Again, you see that kind of language that is being utilized by the same Jesus. We'll come to this in a little bit. Now, pacifistic nations, C.S. Lewis said, will not remain pacifistic for long. That even if you take the course of pacifism and do not try to protect yourself or have a nation that protects you, that the tendency is that you'll be overrun by a nation that is not pacifistic but militaristic and bent on, say, acquiring territory, like we see in the Russians doing. And a lot of people say, well, what about didn't Gandhi and Martin Luther King Jr., weren't they ones who brought about great good through their nonviolent resistance to the oppression of their own day? Yeah, we can say yes, much good was accomplished, but notice the kind of context in which they were protesting and engaging. They were in a Christianized setting. Gandhi with the British Empire, and of course, Martin Luther King Jr. even appealing to the scriptures that Americans held to be as their authority. Well, this helped to bring about a change in mindset, because this Christian book was the source of influence and pricked the conscience of a couple of nations. But in a place like Vietnam or communist China or North Korea, well, people like Gandhi and Martin Luther King Jr. would simply disappeared without a trace. So a lot of times, yes, you can talk about this, but as having an impact, but you also need to consider the broader context as well. So I think it's helpful to bring that into the equation. Now, some people say, well, look, there's some just, what are called just wars, like maybe the Second World War or something like that. There's certain things that were done that were wrong. I mean, my great aunts and great uncle were in Dresden, Germany when it was bombed. It was again a ruthless bombing campaign. I don't think it was justified. I know the arguments for it, but I think that was really going over the top. But just because there are missteps in, by the way, my relatives came over from, my mom's from Latvia. My great aunts and great uncle were from Lithuania, from communist Lithuania, and so they actually were trying to get away from the Soviets and had come to Germany, which was the lesser of two evils. But But anyway, when it comes to missteps like the bombing of Dresden, Germany, well, just because there are missteps taken, it doesn't negate the justice of the cause itself. So again, a lot of times people will dismiss the justice of a cause just because certain missteps have been made in the process, and that obscures the issue of the just war. And we're not talking about justifying everything that takes place in the course of a just war. So anyway, what are the just war principles that are primarily articulated? Well, there are three primary ones, three essential ones, and then four that are more prudential, that are secondary. If you don't have the first three, you don't have a just war at all. Now, the latter four, these will be somewhat variable, and we'll talk about that in a bit. But I just want to put that in perspective. It's not as though all of these are to be treated equally. And again, just war theoreticians, just warriors, as sometimes are called, will highlight the first three as essential. So the first is just cause, that all unprovoked aggression is to be condemned. And again, it's not a matter of hatred of a nation, but it's simply a matter of justice that should be motivating this. And we can talk about, well, aren't you going to be engaged in hatred if you are, fighting against someone? Well, C.S. Lewis said, he said he could imagine that if, he and, I think maybe he was talking about himself, or just, I could imagine a soldier fighting for the Allies and a soldier fighting for Germany. They happen to kill one another, and they see one another in a post-mortem state, that they can kind of, laugh about it and not, have taken anything personally. It was just a matter of, of standing up for, they were standing up for, on two sides of the issue, but it wasn't as though it was there's personal animosity between them. So anyway, but we can talk about this a little bit later. But the point here is self-defense and protection, including the defense of other vulnerable nations, which would be morally legitimate. And of course, as I point out here, that if this first criterion alone were taken seriously, that would eliminate all war and aggression. Secondly, just intent. The only legitimate intention is to secure a just or fair peace for both friend and foe alike. So it rules out revenge, conquest, economic gain, or ideological supremacy. So just intent, and you seek a fair peace at the end of it all. That is what you're aiming for. So even through war, the goal is to establish peace on all sides. There's also to be a lawful declaration by a proper authority. That it's not simply a group of individuals within a nation, like zealots within Israel, or private individuals or parties within the state, but it must be officially declared by a lawful government. So those are the first three that need to be in place for there to be a just war. Then the second four, or then the final four. It's April, not March, but we'll talk about the final four here. The last resort is the next criterion. That when reasonable attempts at negotiation and compromise have been tried and have failed, that there comes a time when action is called for. And again, there are judgments that will be made. It's not as though human beings are perfect, and sometimes there are missteps that are made. But again, these are the principles that are to be guiding. But there are not to be endless negotiations. And people say, well, couldn't there be just one more treaty? Well, let's take a look at the track record and see how this nation is doing in negotiations and in showing good faith or goodwill toward a certain end. It may be an attempt at futility. And so we need to make a judgment on that rather than waiting till till it may even be too late. Think Iran here. Limited objectives. As the goal of a just war is peace, war should not be committed to the destruction of another nation's economy, its political institutions, its gutting its infrastructure, and so forth. No, it should be limited, and again, not a kind of a shock and awe destruction of everything in that nation. 6, limited or proportionate means. That the weaponry and force that should be limited to what is needed to repel the aggression and to deter future attacks. And again, with the goal of securing a just peace. And then finally, non-combatant immunity. That since a war is an official act of the government, that only those who are officially agents of the government may fight, An individual is not actively contributing to the conflict should be immune from attack, unless in cases of supreme emergency. For example, I mentioned here those not contributing to conflict: POWs, medical personnel, casualties, civilian non-participants. But there may be, as in, say, terrorist-type activity, where you have terrorists embedded within civilian populations, which is where it becomes a lot trickier and difficult. So, speaking of which, what about terrorism? I would say that, again, terrorism is often, it can be characterized by four qualities. It is asymmetrical, that it doesn't fight in a nation-state, like a nation-state with a nation-state, like the two legitimate authorities fighting against one another, as in conventional warfare. It is indiscriminate, that it makes no distinctions between combatants and non-combatants. So there is really a disregard for human rights, for fundamental equalities, and doesn't distinguish between guilt and innocence within a population. It's also unconventional, another characteristic, that they will embed themselves in civilian populations, schools, houses of worship, using nail bombs to maim and fire to burn. In fact, the Russians have used a device, Tatiana was just talking with her, as in a fellow Ukrainian, talking about how the Russians have devised these bullets that actually have like little saws that actually, when they enter in, they continue to shred muscle and bone tissue. So that, she told me about one man she knew who was shot and in the leg, and it's so, he had to actually, he could not move, but he shot in the leg, but he could only move on his elbows for 4 kilometers till he could finally find safety. This is happening again in Ukraine. By the Russians. So a lot of, again, this is more like terrorist stuff. Seeking to maim, seeking to bring about that kind of, incapacity that is again just so dreadful. It is also terrorism is also destabilizing. That it threatens global and national political order, aims at the destruction of innocent human life, engages in sabotage of life-enhancing systems. There are cultural, political, economic. You think of the ISIS destroying these museums in the ancient Near East, from the ancient Near, that preserve artifacts from the ancient Near East. Just a sad destruction of civilization, of reminders of civilization, of our history, and really giving the opportunity to rewrite history according to the ISIS ideology. When you erase history, then you can now begin to rewrite it yourselves in your own ideological manner. A response to the issue of terrorism itself, just a brief response, and then we'll look at the biblical text and see what Jesus says about warfare and so forth. Just war principles would apply to terrorism, not simply conventional warfare, but it doesn't mean that simply engaging in a military way, but also cutting off terrorist capabilities. Their sources of funding, gathering and sharing intelligence about individual terrorists and so forth, bringing them to justice. Those are all part of the bigger picture. So it's not just a militaristic response, but there is more to be said about it in terms of strategy and undermining the potential funding and other resources that enable them to flourish in their own negative way. Secondly, I think there is something to Samuel Huntington of Harvard, his mention of the clash of civilizations. Now, it's a politically incorrect thing to say that, but I do think that it is important for us to understand the worldview from which much of our terrorism today springs. That Muhammad himself said that in his farewell speech that Allah has commanded me to fight until all men say there is no God but Allah. And his followers took him seriously. In fact, 100 years later, after Muhammad died in 632 and 732, you have Muslims at the gates of France, in Tours, France, where Charles Martel fights against them and is victorious. But again, there's a vast, again, in the very spirit of Muhammad. And traditionally, over in the history of Islam, there have been two realms under which it operates. That there's the realm of war, and there's the realm of Islam. And anything that is not under the realm of Islam is fair game for being attacked, for jihad. So I think there is something to be said about a clash of mindset. I mean, there was a theocratic mindset Muhammad had in mind. He didn't envision a secular state. Everything is bound up together. There is no, quote, church-state separation in the mind of Muhammad, and of course, Muslims, in many parts of the world throughout history. And there's some in the West who are very sympathetic with church-state relations and think that Islam should go that way. But again, this has not been has not been the history. So we need to understand the worldview from which most terrorism today springs, and call it what it is. Thirdly, we shouldn't choose between false alternatives of pursuing just peacemaking, and also the use of force. There is that just peacemaking is important. That we build bridges, that we break down barriers of misunderstanding. This is very important. I mean, I went to a mosque for a couple of years, and it was a very good opportunity for me to get to know Muslims, for me to hear their stories. It's a great way to learn your own Christian theology. Start talking with Muslims. It's a very, very good mind-sharpening and spirit-deepening experience. But there's also the call for us to engage in doing justice and protecting the innocent. So yes, we ought to build bridges, minimize misunderstandings and so forth, but also it doesn't mean ignoring protecting those who cannot protect themselves. Also, we need to remember that sometimes terrorists often will take the use of force and even death on their side as it will just further spur them on to hostility. But those are the risks that we do take in a world like ours, and that we just need to be prepared for that sort of a thing. If you don't do anything, of course, Winston Churchill said he defined appeasement as continuing to feed the crocodile and hope that it eats you last. And a lot of times when we deal with terrorism, that's really how many people are operating. Just appease them, and hope maybe at the end they'll get us. But in the meantime, we can stave them off. Now, what about Scripture? Scripture, pacifism, and just war. Did Jesus teach pacifism? Well, Jesus does say turn the other cheek in Matthew 5:39. But is he speaking about non-violence here? Well, turning the other cheek is not referring to allowing people to just pummel you physically, violently, forcefully. But it's actually an act of insult. Whether it's with the back of the hand. Someone strikes you on your right cheek, assuming a person is right-handed, he'll hit you with the back of his hand, or just a hitting on the cheek is intended to shame someone. It's intended to insult someone. So Lamentations 3:30 says that let him give his cheeks to the smiters and be filled with insults. Very interesting. It's not an act of violence, but rather an act of shaming, humiliating, insulting. And so Jesus is saying, if someone insults you, be willing to take another insult. Someone shames you, be willing to be ashamed, to be shamed. Don't retaliate, don't take personal vengeance. It's interesting that Jesus himself didn't literally turn the other cheek when he was struck at his trial. But he wanted to know why he was being struck. What wrong had he done so that this command was issued to strike him? So we have Jesus himself not taking this command literally, if you're referring, So it is interesting to see this sort of a thing. Secondly, what about not resisting the evil person? Also found in Matthew 5:39. But we see Jesus resisting evil people all the time. He rebukes the religious leaders in Matthew 23. He cleanses the temple in John 2 and elsewhere. Now, a lot of translators recognize that as we see the New Testament's usage referring back to the Sermon on the Mount, and that the way that it is used can actually deform us to another way of translating it. In fact, there's a legitimate way of translating it. It's, rather than not resisting the evil person, it's don't resist by evil means. It could be translated that way. In fact, that is how Paul uses it in Romans chapter 12, where he's reflecting on some of the things that Jesus says in the Sermon on the Mount, of not returning evil for evil, or not being overcome by evil, but overcoming evil with good. And so here Jesus is, this is being referred to in Romans 12 and also 1 Peter chapter 2, that Jesus, when he was reviled, did not revile in return, but rather entrusted himself to the one who judges justly. So we have Jesus who is, speaking, and a lot of the kind of the leading texts that are used for pacifism, I don't think are actually saying that very thing, and especially as you see Jesus in other contexts, it doesn't seem that that is being that shouldn't be absolutized. Also, we come across some interesting texts by in the Gospels. For example, the disciples have 2 swords, and Jesus says, "It is enough." And we just well, what is? It's an obscure text, but I do wonder, what are the disciples doing with swords anyway? Here they are following Jesus, and they're carrying swords. I mean, what's the deal? I think it raises something interesting. Jesus is saying, of course, he resists Peter when he cuts off the ear of Malchus in the garden, and he gives this kind of he says, those who live by the sword will die by the sword. If you think that that the sword is going to protect you from everything, that's going to be the cure-all to everything, you're misguided, and that's true. We should, people who are just war theorists need to remember that too. That that our hope is ultimately in the Lord. It is not in military might and so forth. And so for Peter to think that this sword will take care of things, Jesus said, no, don't operate by that sort of a mindset. And of course, Jesus was going to the cross, and he had told Peter about that already. But it's interesting, Jesus in Luke 14, kind of matter-of-factly, just mentions this king counting the cost before going to war. Now, if warfare is intrinsically immoral, why is Jesus using this kind of language to speak matter-of-factly of a king? He's going to count the cost. He's going to see how many military men he has before he engages in combat. It's common sense. He's not saying, if a prostitute wants to start a business, she's going to first check out, what her options are and advertising and so forth. She's going to count the cost before. No, she's not. Jesus isn't doing that. I think that would be what Richard Hayes would think. That would, that would fit. But again, we don't see that sort of parallel language being used. I think something that's very telling also is the very that Jesus' own rejection of the militant, nationalistic, zealot option. John Howard Yoder talks about this. That there are these zealots who want to fight against Rome. Again, it's not a it's kind of these small bands of people who want to try to overthrow Rome. But here, he's even if he rejects this this attempt, that itself is not an argument against the possibility of engaging in a just war. So anyway, we'll talk a little bit more about the New Testament in a moment, but let me just say one more thing here, that not all killing, as I said before, is including in war, is inspired by hatred or anger. That there are higher goals that people have in mind, either protecting their nation, or love of comrades, or family. And there's a book by a philosopher at Oxford University. His name is Nigel Biggar, Biggar, and it's called In Defense of War, published by Oxford University Press. And he talks about just war and love of neighbor. And it does an excellent job of unpacking this. So I just refer you to that book, In Defense of War, if you want to read more about this. Let's look at a few more texts here from the rest of the New Testament. It's important that we look not just at what Jesus is saying, but also what other New Testament texts are saying. A lot of times people will just appeal to Jesus and stop there, and they won't see, well, what does the rest of the New Testament actually say? Acts 23. Paul appeals, after his life is he knows his life is under threat, he appeals to the Roman military to protect him. his nephew comes in. He's in Roman custody. He hears about this plot in his life. He says, "You tell the commanding officer what you just told me." And so the commanding officer marshals this vast array of troops to protect Paul as he's escorted up to Caesarea Philippi. Well, so he is going up, or Caesarea. So he is going up to this place under Roman protection, and Paul is expecting this commander to do what he is supposed to do, that he is duty-bound by God to protect those who are innocent. And if there had been a mob that came to attack and, we want Paul, well, Paul would not have flinched if these people had been killed, in trying to attack. And that's what the government is supposed to do, to protect innocent citizens from these, those who are intent on doing these evil things. Paul also later in, as he is on trial, said that if he's being tried as a wrongdoer, he says, if I've done anything worthy of death, I'm not afraid to die. So Paul seems to implicitly acknowledge that there are some things that could be done that are worthy of death, that lethal force could be used in bringing about punishment. Another text is from Romans chapter 13, and this is an important one. In Romans 13, we see how the government, the minister of the state, it says, does not bear the sword for nothing. Now, some people say that this was the sword that tax gatherers would bear, and that it was basically just a symbol of Rome's authority, and that as they go around and collect taxes, they'd have these swords with them, and basically Paul is saying you need to pay your taxes to Rome. Well, this seems to me a good stretch, because the language of wrath and avenger is being used. Now, tax gatherers, as fearful as the IRS may be, to raise it to that level of wrath and vengeance seems to be going too far. But what is interesting is that as we read in chapter 12, Paul is talking about personal relationships. That in your personal relationships, if your enemy is hungry, feed him. If he's thirsty, give him something to drink. Again, notice it's quoting the Old Testament. It's not as though Jesus came up with this idea of loving your enemies and caring for your enemies. No, he's reflecting Old Testament theology. But in chapter 12, it says, that Paul, again, speaking personally to the Romans, he's saying that, again, don't be overcome by evil, but overcome evil with good. Again, referring back to the Sermon on the Mount. He is also saying that, do not take vengeance, but leave room for the wrath of God, because, as the Lord says, vengeance is mine, I will repay. Then those same catchwords are used in chapter 13, where Paul talks about where the vengeance is to be taken. It is through the state, not through the individual, where vengeance is to be taken. So he says that the state, the minister of the state who bears the sword, is a minister of wrath. Same word that's used in chapter 11. Leave room for the wrath of God. Here is the wrath. It is a delegated wrath to the state, where punishment is justifiable. The state has a responsibility to mete out wrath, to be a minister of vengeance. Those same, again, the same words are being used here. Very interesting. So Paul is saying, don't take matters into your own hands, but there is a place that if it's doing its duty properly to protect the innocent, preserve the peace, to punish the guilty. Those P's, preserve the peace, punish the guilty, protect the innocent. That's the duty that the state has. A God-given duty, I might add. And so if a state has this God-given duty, it seems that it would not be a far cry to say that there could be those who actually work for the state as believers to actually carry out this God-given duty, say serving in the military, or serving on the police force to protect the innocent and to punish the guilty. So it seems that we have, again, an image of, with a sword in Romans 13. Again, it's not the image of an officer's ticket book here. It's not as though, speeding ticket, this is the imagery of the sword here. No, the sword has a lethal connotation, and it ought to be taken with its full force. Also, what is very, very interesting is that you have in the New Testament a very positive view of soldiering. A very positive view of soldiering. Now, all the people who are soldiers, it seems, they're people of faith. They're people, like, for example, those who come to John the Baptist. They ask John, what do we do? And he doesn't say, go and lead your life of sin. He says, don't accept bribes. Be content with your wages. But we're soldiers. This is lethal stuff here. Be content with your wages. Don't take bribes. Okay. What does Jesus say to the centurion who, in Matthew 8, when he says, I'm a man under authority. I know, when I say, come, they come. When I say go, they go. And so if you just say the word, I know my servant's taken care of. I know all about this stuff of authority. And Jesus says, never, Gentile centurion, never before have I seen such faith in all of Israel. Wow, he's commanding, or he's commending this centurion who's engaged in, keeping peace, sometimes using force to put down rebellion and so forth. He's doing his job. That's what he's supposed to do. That's what his God-given duty is. But Jesus also commends him for his faith. In fact, greater faith than any of those he has seen in Israel. Very remarkable. We also see that Cornelius is another one who is commended. I mean, he is a centurion. His prayers have ascended to God. And of course, we read about the encounter that he has with Peter in Acts chapter 10. Again, the same sort of commendation, a pious soldier who is being highlighted. And of course, there's again this kind of injuring, even though it's used in spiritual contexts of spiritual warfare and so forth. Again, it's not like Richard Hayes would have us believe that it's tantamount to prostitution. Like we're engaged in adultery for Jesus here. It's not spiritual. No, nothing like that at all. There is a positive view of soldiering, of the military. It's not as though this is somehow inherently immoral. Again, I know it's talking about spiritual warfare, but isn't it interesting that he uses this kind of language, this kind of imagery? Also, certain Old Testament texts suggest a pacifistic view of things. Not a non-pacifistic view, but more of a militaristic idea of a just war, if you will. Again, however we take Ecclesiastes 3:8, there's a time for war, a time for peace. Of course, there's a time to be born, a time to die, and again, there's a debate about who is this teacher? Is he speaking from a godlike perspective, or is he speaking kind of his own cynical mindset? And again, if you read Tremper Longman's commentary on Ecclesiastes, which I would highly recommend, he takes it that there are two voices, and I think it's pretty apparent that the teacher is more cynical, the vanity of vanities, and he thinks that if there's a God, it just seems like he's really set things up to really, he's really not really communicating well. That the just die, the unjust die, they all go to the same place. What's this all about? Kind of the cynicism. And he does say at the end of this teacher, the preacher, Ecclesiastes, he said some wise things and goaded people, in Israel. But the end of the matter is this: fear God and keep His commandments. So the second voice is speaking, qualifying the teacher, saying, yeah, he said some wise things, but he says some things that are, not, not right. But anyway, I would encourage you to take a look at Tremper Longman's book. But I think there is something to be said for, there's a time for war, a time for peace, a time to be born, a time to die. He's simply talking about the basic facts about life, and war and peace would fit in there. But also in the book of Proverbs, we read it says, "Make war by wise guidance." Now he's not talking about killing the Canaanites. He's talking about general principles of warfare here. It says in chapter 24, verse 6, "For by wise guidance you will wage war in an abundance of counselors." There's victory. You want to consult, you want to confer, you want to find out what the alternatives are, and be strategic in what you do. So again, it seems like even in the Old Testament we see some general natural law principles, if you will, when it comes to this. Now, I'm running out of time here. This Constantinian shift. Before, Christians weren't involved in the military, and then after they got the power of the state, they became involved in the military. Well, actually, as you look at the facts, it is a much more mixed bag than that. It's not that, I think that's a more simplistic way of looking at it. For one thing, you do have Christians who have been persecuted. And so Constantine, who embraces Christianity, is now the emperor. How can you imagine breathing a sigh of relief? Wow, Christian faith, we're not going to be harassed anymore by the government. There's relief. And so they're trying to figure out what this, having state power looks like. But we also see that another point is that the New Testament itself is not necessarily anti-militaristic or non-militaristic. We've seen the evidence for that. Another point is that just even the early church fathers, as they write, and also the findings that we have of cemeteries and so forth, or tombs, we see that Christians are involved in fighting in the military. We see, we see a number of reasons for arguing that the bag is mixed. Yes, you do have Tertullian and Origen who are more pacifistic, but they do acknowledge that the government has a place in fighting. And so I've given you some evidence here for that shows that the case for kind of a slam dunk case for pacifism before the time of Constantine simply is not there. That we have Christians fighting in Syria. We have Tertullian talking about how Christians are everywhere in fortresses and military camps. Again, Christians are involved. We see that even Tertullian himself prays for security at home, brave armies, protection of the imperial house. Even though he's a pacifist, he comes to that position. He does acknowledge that there is a place for praying for the protection of the government and so forth, and brave armies and so forth. So again, there are I've given you plenty more to look at here, but again I need to wrap up. But again, I hope that this has been helpful to give you a broad layout of the discussion, a bit of the lay of the land, as we look at the issues of pacifism, as we look at just war, as we look at terrorism, and how we as Christians ought to be engaged. Now, I know that there are some nitty-gritty questions that we can talk about, and so that's what the Q&A time is for. But I've laid out some of the principles, some of the groundwork that can be the source of some of the questions that will come from this point on. So, thank you very much for listening. It's been great to be with you.